Good morning.
Sorry, you disappeared from our ear for a moment and you're back in. Thank you for joining us this morning. We were just discussing with Jackie and Ian there the impending interest rate rise from the Bank of England. It might not happen, as Ian was saying, but the expectation is it probably is. Is that something that you are supporting, another interest rate rise? I know that the TUC and some of the sort of unions are suggesting that actually they shouldn't put the rise in place, that things are too hard for people as it is.
Good morning, yes. Look, I mean, these rate rises clearly they're very difficult for people. Every MP, I think, will have a whole range of constituents who've been in touch about what it means for them, and there's definitely a role for flexibilities in terms of how the banks are treating people who've got mortgages with them to give them a bit of breathing space around this. But the individual decisions the bank needs to make, they've got to be independent of politicians to make sure they're the right decisions. But I would say the role for government, and what we would want to see as the opposition and as a prospective government, is action to make sure we're not as exposed to these inflationary risks as we have been in the past. So the UK is now a significant outlier in terms of where inflation is at compared to the US or the Eurozone. And the kind of things the government should be considering are, first of all, making sure we're not too exposed to fossil fuels, because that's one of the reasons we've been so vulnerable going into this crisis. It is things like making sure there are enough workers in the economy, and the big issue there is not persuading over 50s back in, it's making sure those NHS waiting lists come down so people who want to work can work. And it's also things like making sure the kind of trading relationship we've got with other countries, particularly in this case, the European Union, is one where you're minimising those checks, particularly on things like food, because food inflation has been a massive source of difficulty for people. They're the things that the government could be focused on. The individual decisions of the bank have to be left to the bank, but those are the political agenda, the economic agenda that we would want to see, because there is no doubt this is a period of extreme pain for a lot of people.
So does Labour support the giving of new licences for more drilling in the North Sea? Because, of course, that is one of the areas that the government has come out strongly on. The criticism of, many have criticised it, of course, because we've got climate change and so on. But it sounds like you think that might be a good idea, and Labour, if they were to get in, wouldn't revoke those licences.
No, we don't think this is a good idea, and we've been very clear on that. We have said we won't revoke any existing licences. We're trying to provide the long-term framework for investment that business needs. But the reason extending those oil and gas licences is the wrong decision is because if you look at the beginning of the crisis, the energy crisis, when the Russians illegally invaded Ukraine, it wasn't the quantity of Russian gas that we were exposed to that was the problem. It was the price of gas on that regional and international market. So if you have a system, and our electricity system is heavily tied to the value of gas, the cost of gas in the system, you're never going to get the kind of energy independence and security that we all want to see. So there's no doubt that extending those licences is the wrong decision in terms of climate change, but it's the wrong decision in terms of energy security and also the cost and the impact of that cost on the British economy. So the government's gone in completely the wrong direction on that. What we should be looking at is nuclear and renewables and hydrogen and the whole range of things that not only give us energy security, but they bring down the costs in the long term. And so what we saw from the government this week, I'm afraid, was the wrong decision.
Yeah, and what you touch upon there is that real dilemma that Labour itself is tussling with. The dilemma between looking after the environment, making it safer, but also looking at the cost. For example, the loss of the Uxbridge... Well, I say the loss, you didn't win Uxbridge, which was the point, not taking Boris Johnson's old seat when it was deemed yours to take as Labour. It came down to ULEZ, this, the sort of clean air policy being extended. That is a real issue, isn't it? Because, Sadiq Khan wants to bring that in. He's a Labour mayor. But at the top of the Labour Party, they're not sure about it. So where do you stand on that this morning?
Well, first of all, yes, I think it's fair to say ULEZ was the cause of not winning the Uxbridge by-election. I think we can't hide away from that. I mean, ULEZ is a clean air policy as opposed to a net zero policy, and we do think it should be paused and looked at again in the context of the cost of living crisis,
which is important,
so
isn't
acute
it?
Particularly
in a place like London that has, can have very bad pollution. And we've seen really terrible stories of young children with terrible illnesses because of pollution.
There's no doubt about the fact that toxic air is a huge issue and has to be improved. It's really about the route that is necessary to get there, whether that's through scrappage of older vehicles or an upfront charging system. And obviously a huge amount of our frustration is the government has put this legal duty onto local areas, particularly onto urban areas that have in the main Labour mayors, puts this policy in place, asks them to use a charging regime to deliver that, and in this case specifically tied that to the finances of Transport for London and the deal that was done there, and then it campaigns against it. So we do feel that is duplicitous. But the longer-term picture, you're right to ask about the tension, I think, between some of the policies around net zero and the environment and the cost of those and the cost of living crisis. But I would just say, if you look at the big development in the last 5 to 6 years, it's that on things like renewable energy, the costs have actually come in at under the cost of fossil fuel prices. So many of the times when we're looking at this, it's not a tension between what's right for the environment or for net zero and what's right for the economy and the cost of living. The two things go hand in hand, and you can't tackle that cost of living crisis unless you're being ambitious on reducing our exposure to things like fossil fuels. And the government, I'm afraid, doesn't understand that, and I don't think the arguments they've put forward this week stand up against that kind of scrutiny.
Ian, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, the Labour are split on the whole issue of ULEZ. You know, it's something that they've been so combined in many ways. They're creating such a lot of momentum. Then all of a sudden, this issue on ULEZ, and I don't doubt with your radio phone-in show, there are lots of Londoners that you speak to, and I think where Jonathan Reynolds' constituency is in Greater Manchester, and they've got a pause on what they were going to do for Manchester as well, that it's a really divisive issue for people.
It is, and it's very interesting this week that the Conservatives have come out with quite a few different policies which give the impression that they're starting to go away from the whole climate change agenda. I mean, I think the impression is possibly different from the reality, but sort of we're on the side of the motorists. There's a war on motorists, and we're on the side of motorists. But then you look at the opinion poll this week that YouGov did that shows that most motorists think that Labour are on their side, which, given the ULEZ scheme, you think, well, that's a bit odd. But I think what the Conservatives have done this week is effectively fly a kite and saying, is this something that is going to be popular with the electorate, particularly people who are prone to voting Conservative but maybe thinking of not voting Conservative? So it's a core vote strategy in a sense.
It's a punchy slogan, isn't it? We were talking about this earlier, but we're on the side of the motorists for the Tories, and that's the sort of thing that cuts through, especially when there's a divide, as we were just talking about with Jonathan Reynolds, in the Labour Party area.
There's in politics, one of the things that I think I've learned is the strength of people's feelings about being able to drive their cars. I mean, I remember back when we were in government and there was the fuel crisis, you know, that was a big issue it was a big, very difficult issue for the government. And you've seen Labour slightly struggling with it since...
Well, Rachel Reeves, who may well be our next Chancellor, says it's not the right time to clobber motorists, right? And Keir Starmer is going, oh, it's not a yes-no issue. You know, as always, sort of tends to sit on the fence until he knows which way the wind's blowing.
I think that's quite a big shift for Labour, and you heard Johnny Reynolds saying it there now. Not out-and-out support for ULEZ by any means at all, which has, of course, created potentially some tension between the Mayor of London and the centre of the Labour Party, except that everything at the moment that Labour is doing, understandably, is about maximising its vote and making it more likely that it will get into government in order to be able to implement the longer-term policies that Johnny was talking about.
Can we just go back to Jonathan Reynolds, if you're there? I know one of the reasons... Good morning, are you there still? Hello, there you are. You wanted to come on to talk, I think, about what you perceive as the mismanagement, don't you, of the economy as a whole. But as we're hearing, you know, sort of being on the side of the motorists, punchy things that cut through are what are generally going to stick in the minds of the voters. What is it that you want to talk about this morning, which you hope will stick in the mind of voters?
Well, one of the stories we're highlighting this morning is actually the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's record as Chancellor on things like managing the national finances, which is not as strong as he would perhaps like to present it as. So, for instance, we're highlighting today that in 2020, the Institute of Fiscal Studies said to manage the debt from the pandemic, we need to make sure we're doing that, much like we financed, to be honest, debt in wartime, very long-term dated gilts, which are the best way to manage to secure against short-term interest rate rises, to make sure that debt is manageable for the long term. Now, Rishi Sunak didn't do that. He opted for very short-term, index-linked, exposed securities, and that therefore means if we do see, for instance, a rate rise today, we're more exposed to that than we should be. And if you compare our record to other comparable countries, the G7 countries, big developed countries, actually we're now in a much more vulnerable position than we otherwise would have been. If you think back to crises like the global financial crisis, it was through that management of very long-term debt that we found the best way forward around that. So we feel whether it's about policies for the future around net zero and the cost of living and the environment, or the government's own record, there's a lot to criticise, and that's why we're out putting our alternative forward, seeking to win people's trust and form the next government.
It's interesting because, to me, you know, using phrases like index-linked and gilts, I'm not sure, whilst everything that Jonathan Reynolds is saying may well be true or up for debate, Is it a vote winner? Labour are ahead by 20 points, we must say, at this stage.
And there's a range of things that Labour needs to talk about, and some of it needs to be a sort of doorstep retail offer, but some of it also needs to be winning that argument about economic competence, and that's always Labour's challenge in going into an election. And I think that's what Johnny was demonstrating. I mean, you know, a criticism of the Tories, who usually hold that mantle of economic competence, that perhaps they're not, and a sort of explanation about what Labour would do differently.
I think what you put your finger on something there, saying, look, you can talk about gilts until you're blue in the face, but it's not something that connects with ordinary people. If you say, well, because of those decisions that Rishi Sunak made as Chancellor, it's cost every household in this country £500, people can relate to that. And you can, from the data, you can extrapolate how much it does cost.
And the interesting thing is, when you think of Rishi Sunak in 2020, I immediately think furlough. And I think how many millions of people were grateful for furlough? It was an extraordinary scheme,
and
very
didn't know the
expensive.
phrase furlough before it.
No. Yeah, they were grateful for it, but it cost a lot of money.
Absolutely,
and the
it
point
cost a
that's
lot of
being
money.
raised here is, how did he finance it, and was that actually competent, the way that he did it?
Yeah.
So Jonathan Reynolds, are you worried then that, as Ranvir points out, and we're just saying, that the terminology of what you're explaining there needs to cut through and people need to understand, you know, in simple terms, exactly what it means to them?
Absolutely. Look, I'll always take the advice of a wise panel like this, and I can tell Ian Dale it's £2,000 per household based on the mismanagement of what we have had from Rishi Sunak as Chancellor. But look, the simple question...
Say it, then?
Absolutely. The simple question that most people will ask when we're canvassing on the doorstep or getting in touch with us or ringing into a radio or television show like this is, are they better off after 13 years of Conservative government? And the simple answer to that is no. We're happy to prosecute that point, but we also have to put forward our alternative. And that's why our agenda around the economy, on industrial strategy, on our Green Prosperity Fund, on using net zero not just to tackle environmental problems, but to get the good jobs of the future, reform of business rates, the apprenticeship levy, how universities work and interact with their local economies. This is all the positive agenda, but it's the two things that need to go hand in hand. And I do think people are fed up with this government. I do think they're willing to look at us. If you look not just at the headline polls, but where people stand on the issues, they're very favourable to us. But we know there's more work to do, and we'll keep working until we finally get news of when a general election is going to take place, and we can put that argument forward.
But there are 495 people in the constituency of Uxbridge who changed all of that, didn't they?